Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor and enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
Neil Almond.
Hello.
And Elliot Morgan.
Hello.
And together we're going to explore pupil progress meetings, and in particular how, if at all, we can get the most from them. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
This week I took a little return to a book that I read a year or so back called The Elements of Eloquence by Mark Forsyth. It's a fascinating little exploration of the tools of rhetoric and how they've been employed in English literature and beyond. It's fascinating, really easy read for anyone interested in language. And what I loved about it is after reading it, I started to spot little patterns amongst some of the most captivating lines in English literature, but also in television, films, etc. I felt like it gave me a nice little rubric against which to understand language a little bit better in how it's employed. So yeah, love that. What about you, Neil? What are you reading for?
So I've gone back to an article which I probably read about maybe 2 years ago, but I think someone brought it back to my attention. So I thought, yeah, that's one to look at. And that's The Early Maths Trajectory, Low-Income Children's Mathematics Knowledge from Ages 4 to 11. And that's by Bethany Riddle-Johnson, Kerry Hoffer, Emily Fife, and Dale Farron, an American study that just kind of looks at mathematical knowledge from the ages of 4 to 11, just particularly highlights that importance of patterning and that idea of spatial reasoning, and this idea that these are, in an American context, pretty good predictors for 5th grade, which would be our year 6 anyway. So what that was like in 1st grade, it tends to be a good predictor for 5th grade mathematics, depending on what their spatial reasoning and their patterning was like. Not necessarily knowledge about shape, but can they recognize patterns, etc. Given that in the new early years framework, those early learning goals, shape, space, and measure has been taken out of it being in terms of it being a goal. That's not to say that it's not important that teachers teach that. And this is just kind of something that I wanted to have in my back pocket in case I do come across teachers, early years providers who do think that we no longer need to think about spatial reasoning and measure and shape and things like that, but also to hopefully guide them as to how that might be used most effectively to make sure that kids at the start of their mathematical journey get the best chances. Elliot, what are you reading for?
So I too have been revisiting something by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. It's about backward design. It's sort of they've done a book on instructional design, but it's one part of it. And it's an idea that I think I've discussed with you guys before. The idea of just starting with the end and then working backwards. So thinking about the end goal first, thinking about the evidence required for pupils to show that they've met that goal, and then designing your instruction from that. Not exactly a radical point of view, but I think where, especially in primary, we have this over-reliance to use ready-made schemes. It's quite an interesting point, so definitely worth a read. What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
I've been reading the blog by Charlotte McKechnie this week, linguisticphonics.wordpress.com. I think she's got about 20, I think, really well-written blogs. And so if you're interested in that part of early literacy, then I would definitely recommend checking it out. So then the focus of this episode is pupil progress meetings. And I think, especially with people listening in different parts of the world, as always, the most sensible thing to do is explain what we mean by pupil progress meetings. Chris, how would you define them?
By the narrowest definition of them that I can imagine, pupil progress meetings are half-termly or sometimes termly meetings between school leaders and teachers to discuss the academic progress of individual students in class, usually I'd say with a focus on core subjects. That said, more commonly, they're a chance for teachers to discuss all aspects of the development of every child in their class, looking at both academic learning and things like personal and social development, with the aim of ensuring that all students are supported in a way that best fits their individual needs.
It's really well summed up. And I think if we have, say, for instance, 2 form school, and you want all, say, 14 to 16 teachers to talk about the pupils in your class, that's going to take quite a lot of time to cover so that those meetings can take place. What should we try and avoid doing to make sure that that time doesn't become wasted time?
I think one thing, just from speaking from experience of being on the teacher side of it, is having the leadership being too critical and sort of pinpointing error and thinking that it should be sort of more solutions focused. Like, you're aware that a child or a group of children are behind, or perhaps not making the progress that is expected of them. And I think the narrative should be more focused on to what are we going to do now to push them on, rather than like focusing too heavily on how they've come to that point where they're not making the expected progress.
Yeah, I think because I've recently been on the other side of it, where I've been the person who's the other side of the table, kind of asking teachers, and it's something that I know when I was the teacher didn't feel like it was always probably done right. So I think the things that we can avoid doing is that, first and foremost, we need to be really clear that the idea that this one person, this class teacher, is somehow inherently responsible for all the progress that this child makes is a fundamentally flawed idea. The idea that, you could hold anyone really, I think, to account that depending on what kind of school you're in, this child hasn't made 2 sub-levels of progress already. There are so many other factors out there that contribute to student attainment far more actually than the teacher that's actually in front of them. So I think it's definitely one thing to avoid is any kind of teacher blame or any kind of teacher responsibility. Now, I know that some teachers go into this and they can't help but feel responsible because they do teach them all the time. And I understand that, but I think that's why the messaging from SLT needs to be quite clear that this isn't almost like, it's not an interrogation to your teaching ability. It's not an interrogation as to what are you actually doing in that classroom. For me, it was just, and this is saying my context is a 1-form entry primary school. It was just a good time for me to actually, as a leader, get to know those kids and actually hear about the different issues that teachers were having with certain things. And that meant I could either think about what those intervention groups might look like. Maybe that means we will have some from year 3, we'll have some from year 4, because we can do something clever with the time because there is this issue across both classes. But it also just helps me understand what the teachers are going through and how I can best support them on that kind of strategic level.
I like the point you started with there, Neil, in particular, talking about the ways in which pupil progress meetings became, and often do become still, about accountability and a very specific kind of numerical accountability. At points in my career, I've been in pupil progress meetings where the discussion has been along the lines of, well, at the start of the year, 73% of your children were at the expected standards, though it wouldn't have been that language at the start of my career, but the equivalent, talking about they were at a 3B, what percentage of them do you think are going to get to a 4C, etc. And it was that fine grain and that silly. And I think that's an unfortunate thing and definitely something to avoid. Linked to that, I've found in the past that certain pupil progress meetings came about the attempt to manipulate those statistics. So you would have a child or a group of children that were at a given point in their learning when it came to at a key accountability stage, like key stage 1, and you would have a discussion that started with something like, oh, well, you've got a lot of kids in your class that were at a 2C in year 2, so that really gives us a lot of work to get them to a level 4 in year 6, yada, yada, yada. And in fact, we'd have situations where a kid had surprised us and had achieved particularly well, and the conversation then went, oh, well, they're where they need to be now. Let's start thinking about other children. Well, actually, why? Why are we not still thinking about their progress as much as we're thinking about anyone else's? So, yeah, the manipulation of statistics was something to avoid. I'm sure it's still part of the job for some people, but yeah, it's something that can really undermine pupil progress meetings. I think another thing I found from Pupil Progress Meetings is coming out with a list of 17 different interventions that we're going to implement because of a sort of tick box attitude. Any child that isn't exactly where we need to be because we've got this false idea of linear progression, well, there's an intervention for that. And so you come away thinking, how on earth am I going to sort all this stuff out in the autumn term, for example, of the following year? Sorry, the spring term after the autumn term. I think also, dare I say, the frequency of meetings often ends up having quite an impatient attitude towards things like interventions. You know, you've got a half-termly pupil progress meeting, which means, has that intervention that you've done for half a term had the impact that you wanted it to? And in some cases, that's 4.5 weeks. And so, yeah, we can end up having what we think is a good idea in terms of an educational time span being defined itself by pupil progress meetings. I would say the last thing I would definitely avoid, and as I've seen come about, is a sense of futility or pessimism because of the nature of the conversations, where teachers don't want to feel like they're not doing a particularly good job when they are faced with students who are struggling. And so school leaders are tempted to say with the odd child, oh, well, we know this child is always going to struggle because of X or Y or Z, just as a way of overcoming the discomfort of that conversation. So I think avoiding that sense of pessimism or futility is a really key thing in pupil progress meetings.
Yeah, just a link to one of the points that Krista said, talking about manipulating statistics. I don't know if this is as prevalent now as it once was, but I think a lot of schools did link pay progression to the statistics or numbers that teachers achieved in their class. And it just didn't or doesn't have the intrinsic motivational effect that leaders might think it does. And building that sort of external pressure and these high stakes could and does lead to inaccurate measurement of progress. And that's not to say that teachers are dishonest, just that we're all human. None of us are infallible. It can happen.
I think there's one other thing as well that I think is best avoided as well. This is probably more at a senior leadership level rather than at the teacher level, but that's this idea that through these meetings that you may have, this idea that then you can kind of extrapolate and make these kind of big inferences about specific groups, whether that be kind of gender or EAL groups versus non-EAL, or PPG versus non-PPG, and kind of the idea that you can go, oh, X percentage of pupil premium children are only achieving this. At these kind of numbers we're talking about, the 1 form entry, 2 form entry school, one child can be, anything kind of between, 3 to 7 percentage points. So I would definitely say it's not necessarily worth thinking, oh God, we have a massive problem from this data with pupil premium children, just because the data just doesn't really, because of the sample size of your schools, you don't really get that kind of rich data that actually provides you with that overview that you think you're getting. So there's no need to then have a pupil progress meeting across the whole school, think then that there's this whole issue with writing with the boys, and so therefore you spend the next half term thinking about, well, how can we just improve the progress for boys writing, for example. It's not needed. Just make sure that you are still teaching every child as well as possible. And I honestly think the rest will take care of itself.
Linked to that then, I would say that if in doubt, if your teachers are worried about a pupil progress meeting beforehand, then something is awry. That's the number one thing to avoid. Having a situation where teachers are nervous about pupil progress meetings because it'll have an impact on their career development or their salary, or just because they see it as part of a larger accountability measure rather than as an opportunity to support the children in their class.
I think just from listening to you guys, there are a few themes that are sort of arising. And I don't know if they're born from sort of mass sort of misinterpretation of different systems, but like I'm thinking about, the responsibility of one teacher. It goes back to the idea that, when we have our Key Stage 2 statutory assessments, at least 50% of that content is coming from years 3, 4, and 5. And all of the content will have been covered, the whole way through primary. So it's very clear that if we are breaking the programs of study, so to speak, down into year groups, and I know the national curriculum does that in the core subjects, but if we see the big picture as this is the journey we're going on from start to finish, and we use that sort of approach that we're always talking about, where we are thinking about where are our pupils now, where are they going to next, and then have our ultimate endpoint in mind, I think you almost avoid the responsibility of one, or certainly on the shoulders of one person. And things like reducing data, or reducing pupils to data. I remember those days, and the subdivisions of the points, I think you've said before, Chris, just got smaller and smaller and smaller until they took levels away altogether because they were essentially meaningless. You had levels 3, 4, 5, and potentially 6, and then you had each of those had 3 subdivisions, and I think we also had subdivisions of those letters, so you'd have an A minus, A plus kind of situation going on. And I think we were probably quite fortunate as a profession that someone got involved, because I don't think we could have gone any smaller. We would have had this like an atomic level on which we were assessing the pupils, and I think it's the information we have, how summative is it, and how can we use the information we have to best sort of serve our pupils. And I think when we don't understand data sets, like you say, I find that grouping on such a small scale is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. But if you have a massive scale, like a whole nation and their set of results, you possibly could make some reliable inferences. But I think it's when we don't understand the use of data, and when we don't see the curriculum in its intended way, I think that's where things like this come from. And it's almost trying to avoid those generalizations that allow us to get the most.
Just on that point, Kieran, I think it was Amanda Spielman, actually, I think 4 or 5 years ago, was giving a speech when, just as the DFE data workload group had reported back, and paraphrasing here massively, but I think she basically said, unless you're doing that kind of number crunching in terms of grouping, either at the minimum, the local authority level, or and even then you still need to be careful, it's just not worth the time or effort that you're actually putting in to do that. So it's a win-win for everyone. Senior leaders can save some time from actually having to do all that number crunching and then thinking about what they're going to have to do about it. And then that saves teacher time, because they then don't have to implement any kind of weird and wonderful interventions or kind of whole class kind of teaching methods that the SLT kind of put in as a result of that data crunching. So definitely one to avoid. And I'm sure James Pembroke's book, Data Busting for Primary Schools, will put to bed, hopefully, quite a lot of these myths. And it's definitely one that everyone should be on everyone's to buy list for 2022 for sure.
Yeah, and I probably should have preceded my sort of response by saying that no one's ever trained for this kind of data analysis, and the system sort of pushed us in this direction, and certainly it was already being pushed in that direction when I came in. And I think if we go to your ideal scenario, Neil, where eventually Key Stage 1 SATs go, then I think you allow yourself to see that 7-year gap and think, well, okay, what can we achieve in this 7-year period? But because I'm hearing more positive stories about Pupil Progress Meetings, but I think that's a necessary step for us to get anywhere close to our ideal, which I think leads on quite nicely then to our ideal situation. What should we do to try and get the most from our Pupil Progress Meetings?
In order to get the most out of Pupil Progress Meetings, I think it's sort of, you need to think about both before and afterwards. And for me, not so much what actually occurs in the meeting itself. So in terms of before, like questioning what assessments do we use? Are we relying solely on teacher assessment? Because that's obviously open to bias. Are we using summative assessments where possible, and then sort of doing a comparative judgment of the two to get a better picture or understanding of pupils and where they're at? I too was on the other side for the first time this year as a leader conducting these Pupil Progress Meetings. And something that some of the teachers were doing coming in, I thought was really, really a really good piece of practice that I'm going to now ask them to do every time going forward is they were coming in and they'd already done their own analysis of the data. They were coming in and going, right, you can see this and that and blah, blah, blah. I found that so useful, saved a lot of time, and also just gave me a much better picture of their understanding of their assessment. The other side of it, I would say, would be what you do afterwards. So how do you react? I think the monitoring afterwards is more important than the meeting itself. So those sort of regular informal check-ins with teachers, see if those interventions you put in place are working. Keeping in mind, obviously, what Chris said earlier about you need to give interventions time to bed in. You can't just expect something to give you huge progress after 4 weeks. But that will save you a lot of time when the next pupil progress meetings come around. If there are sort of broader issues that you identify in school-wide, then react with some CPD or something to tackle them. If you identify that like arithmetic is an issue across 3 or 4 year groups, then react accordingly with some CPD to tackle that issue. So yeah, for me, it'd be what you do before and afterwards that helps you to get the most out of the meetings rather than the actual meeting itself.
I think you touched on this, Morgs, as well, but I just want to kind of enunciate it again. Focus as much as possible on how things can be better for the students rather than what led to the current situation. It can be tempting in pupil progress meetings to begin feeling like you need to justify yourself or to rationalize your choices and start saying, well, this little group of kids, I don't think that this happened in, years gone by. And regardless of whether that's the case, that's very rarely going to actually contribute to making the situation better. So focusing on what comes next, what can be put in place, rather than what may or may not have contributed to that situation is, a really positive thing to do. Because time is often short in these meetings. As I think you mentioned earlier, Kieran, they're often brief. There's a lot of things to discuss. And so there's another time to be thinking about wider issues that might have led to certain situations in a given class. Thinking of these as opportunities to explore what more experienced colleagues have to offer in a given situation. In most circumstances, what you have is a slightly less experienced teacher, not always. Sometimes the teacher is the most experienced person in the room, but often you have a less experienced teacher who has excellent knowledge of a group of students, talking about this group of students to some senior leaders who perhaps have a bit more teaching experience, but don't have an intimate knowledge of these children and their learning. And finding a way to learn from the advice that's given by these more experienced colleagues is why you're there. It's why the meeting is happening. But with that in mind, we also have to think about how these meetings are going to differ. If you're a senior leader conducting these meetings, they are going to differ when you are talking with, say, an NQT than they are with someone who's got 20 years teaching experience. Because with an NQT who says, I've got this issue in the classroom, or I'd like to address this, they might need a lot more of kind of directive support and advice. Whereas with a really experienced teacher with a great deal of expertise, it might be the case that, or it's likely to be the case, that any suggestions you make are things that they've already tried or that they just want a little bit of clarification on, etc. So be ready to think of these meetings as slightly different beasts depending on the experience and expertise of the teacher and the senior leaders involved. Slightly mundane thing, try not to squeeze them all into one day. I just remember having pupil progress meetings where I taught in year 6, and so we were the last one of the day, and we'd be squeezed in at 4:30, and you could see that the leaders who were conducting these meetings had done this for the whole day, and by 4:30 they were just done in, and the extent to which they were then fully ready to discuss the minutiae of children's academic attainment and social and emotional development just wasn't there to the same extent as I'm sure it was earlier in the day. Where I've seen these done particularly well, and I know this isn't always possible, but where I've seen them done well, they've been organized so that the leaders in question don't necessarily have to have all of these meetings kind of crushed into one day. So yeah, those are some things I would look out for. Oh, one last thing. I know that I was very defensive as a teacher when I went into these meetings. I felt like I was being judged, and to an extent, these meetings became more productive, not through any major changes that I experienced from the leaders in question, but from a slight change in my attitude towards them when I became a little bit more confident in what I was doing. So just on an attitude level, trying not to feel too defensive when your class is talked about is something to try and do to make sure that these meetings are as productive as possible.
Not too much more to add. I think all the main points have been covered. I just think what I have done and what I think teachers found quite useful when we did our pupil progress meetings, that they were about a week or two just after we had one of our data drops. We only do 3 a year, so only 3 data drops. They were about a week and a half, a week to 2 weeks kind of after that. So they had the most up-to-date data that the system was telling us. But with that as well, we also provided them with attendance data as well, because that's something that doesn't tend to be given out. But it's really kind of easy to see why little Martha isn't making expected progress. And it changes that narrative from, well, what have you been doing, to, well, yeah, do you know what, actually, she's not been in school for a third of the term so far. And then that turns it to this more kind of whole school level. What can we, on these these wider whole school systems that are in place that perhaps the class teacher doesn't see, that can be put in place, or that can be checked on to make sure that that side of things is working. So, is our attendance officer picking this stuff up? Are they then chasing that up and making sure that there are legitimate especially given the past 18 months that we've had, are there legitimate reasons why poor little Martha has missed a third of the term, and then what we can kind of do from there. So I think doing these properly, I think, actually means that there's more work for leaders to do afterwards than there perhaps is for the individual teacher. It's not to say that the teacher kind of goes and thinks, yeah, that's all done and dusted. Certainly when we discussed some of the intricacies as to why they said that children weren't making progress, I was able to say, well, try A, B, C in a very, not I'm going to come and see you in a week's time and I'm expecting to see it, but, just try it out. But it certainly means that senior leaders should be taking the temperature. If 3 or 4 of your teachers are saying, yeah, well, behavior's been a bit rocky, that's a warning system for you to go, okay, maybe we need to go and have a look at whole school behavior again and sort that out before we necessarily, not that I think anyone should, but before some leaders may necessarily pin like the whole progress or lack of progress on one individual teacher.
So I think yours sort of feeds into my ideal, and I do appreciate I'm speaking in ideals, but my sort of perfect model places a lot more work on the shoulders of those people who are in leadership, whether that be those responsible for attendance, those responsible for, perhaps the Senko, with an oversight of interventions that are taking place in school, or, pupils with profound needs or challenges. And I think you almost end up with, in my ideal world, one meeting, say May or June, because I find any meetings that happen in July, you're getting diminishing returns because of, the proximity towards the end of the academic year. People's minds naturally shift towards September. So I would almost have it that if, for instance, you've got a system like, you guys had STEP, Neil, and you have your same day intervention, and your person who's responsible for that and has general oversight might be thinking, well, which of these pupils are coming back regularly, and or maybe they're talking to the teachers about who is attending these, perhaps more than the other pupils, because I know that Matt said in the past before that sometimes a very specific intervention, I think it was the Engelman intervention in maths that for instance, that he would use, along with the attendance, and then those people having conversations, maybe in an SLT meeting, about things that can happen on a school-wide level. And so that removes the need to have a meeting after 13 weeks and then after 20-ish weeks. And instead, you could have one close to the end of the year, maybe 30 weeks into the year. And you almost have the people who have the expertise sitting down and having a conversation about the classes. So for instance, if an NQT did come in, the Senko will have a broad experience, you'd hope, of pupils and various different challenges. So they may have seen the behaviors or the experiences that the newly qualified teacher is expressing, and then they can say, okay, well, this might be the solution in that situation. Obviously, if one of us were to sit in the meeting, we would have seen this before. We could say, well, I think this group of pupils needs this. But I think if you structure sort of the way leadership behaves across the year, then you take that pressure from teachers. Does that make sense?
That makes all sorts of sense. I would, alongside that, add the idea that the meetings I've been in that have been most productive have been the ones where, while they've had a solutions focus, have recognized that neat, immediate answers aren't always available. And sometimes just saying, oh, okay, well, that's something we need to keep an eye on. Let's observe that for a little while. Let's come back to that in. It feels like kicking the can down the road, but there are also circumstances where you just don't know enough about the pupil or about that situation or about that circumstance. And so while there can be a tendency to want a neat answer, that isn't possible and it perhaps isn't healthy. But just keeping track of those things as well, not letting them go, just saying, okay, that's on the agenda for next time. Let's keep an eye on that over the next few months. It doesn't have to wait to the the next pupil progress meeting. If you need to speak to me about that, just come and do it. So actually, one of the things perhaps coming from that is to not see the pupil progress meetings as the opportunity to talk about your students with senior leaders. I think it goes without saying, perhaps, but I'm going to say it anyway, that in a really good school environment, you should feel that if you ever have a concern or something you want to share or something you just want some advice on, that you wouldn't think twice about approaching the senior leaders in your school, even if in the back of your mind, you're thinking you don't feel like it will reflect well on you as a teacher. Because that's often one of the worries we have. We'll go, I don't want to say that this child is struggling with mathematics because, well, what does that say about me as a maths teacher? And getting past that and having a culture in school that helps teachers to get past that is something that's really valuable and supports really effective pupil progress meetings.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, because common issues with pupils' development and literacy are often pretty frequent behaviors in younger children. For instance, if we think about the reversal of digits and letters, they're pretty frequent up until about 7 years of age. And so even if you notice them when a pupil is 4, 5, or 6, there's really not much you can do in that situation. And I think even an educational psychologist, whoever is brought in to do any sort of assessment, will say, well, this is developmental. This happens to almost, if not every child. So like you said, taking that tempered approach, making a note of it, and then seeing how things play out, I think it is definitely the wise approach. Because if we over intervene too early, I think you're at risk of taking the pupil's independence from them. Because there are lots of stages, and I'm thinking about maths in particular. A lot of the stages, if you go to learning trajectories, they're incomplete sort of pieces of knowledge. There'll be one about, when pupils are counting 5 objects, one of the stages that they need to go through is incorrectly counting those objects and assigning the correct number names, but to the different values. So I saw one video the other day, and there were 3 objects, and the pupils started going 4, 5, 6. And so Clements and Sarama saw that as a necessary point in development. And if we pick that up and say, this child has something wrong with them, this child needs intervention, well, actually, we're deploying our resources in the wrong direction. And I think it's about having that mindset, like you say, Chris, about let's see how this pans out, because not all the time will it be an indicator that something is going wrong. So Chris, we set out looking for 8 ways to help us get the most from pupil progress meetings. How did we do?
We said that it was essential to question and fully understand what has contributed to any data being discussed. We said that we needed to informally monitor what comes from pupil progress meetings and not to see these as a standalone meeting, react accordingly to these meetings effectively, and see them as an opportunity to share and redistribute responsibility and learn from more experienced colleagues. We needed to recognize that any attainment data that is discussed is blurry, effectively, and that learning is always non-linear. And so not to say, look for a linear trajectory of learning for students. We needed to recognize as school leaders that the nature of the meeting will have to be flexible depending on the level of experience and expertise of the teacher in question. Obviously, a less experienced teacher will need more support than one that perhaps has greater expertise. We said that it was important to try not to feel judged and thus be defensive in these meetings, and equally that leaders needed to not give any reasons for teachers to feel defensive. And the best way to achieve this is to see everything that comes from these as opportunities for instruction rather than deficiencies in students or teachers. Consider a wide array of factors such as attendance and potential peer group issues. We have to see it not just as a single opportunity for this sort of conversation, but actually that the whole school year is an opportunity for these sorts of conversations where appropriate and where time allows with senior leaders. And finally, we said that it was important to bear in mind that there won't always be neat, immediate answers from these pupil progress meetings, and that sometimes we need a little patience and just need to take the opportunity to observe and keep track of something ready for a later meeting or a later conversation, rather than trying to feel like we have to solve everything straight away.
Excellent. Another fascinating chat. I think all that's left to say is that thank you very much for joining me, Chris.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you very much.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.